In the dry heart of Wyoming, where the wind gnawed at fence lines and the earth carried the ghost of cattle drives long past, the Cheyenne auction yard waited beneath a brittle sky. Dust hung in the air with the weight of memory, and every hoof that struck the pat ground seemed to echo with the verdict of history. That morning, the stalls had shifted their usual rhythm. Palominos with gentle eyes had been led through the gates and sold to nods of satisfaction. Stocky ranch geldings had been exchanged for folded bills and claps on the back. Yet, beneath it all, the crowd carried a tension that tightened with each sale, as though they knew the real spectacle had not yet come. Buck Tanner, the auctioneer with shoulders broad from a lifetime of ranch work, stood at the block, his hat low against the sun, eyes scanning the restless crowd. He felt it too, the waiting, the subtle draw of rumor that had circled town for weeks. They called it a Shire stallion, though to some he looked less like a horse and more like a verdict from nature itself, a thing too large to house and fierce to claim. People spoke of broken rails, bones snapped under hooves, and handlers thrown like rag dolls. And so, even before the lot number was spoken, the mood in the yard had shifted from commerce to unease. The steel gates groaned as the yard boys dragged them shut, reinforcing crossbars added only for this animal. The creak of hinges scraped across the silence. Men who leaned easily on rails for every other horse now stepped back, arms folded, their boots grinding gravel, as though to prepare for flight. Then the stallion emerged. He filled the pen like a storm cloud rolling across an open plain, black as a sky about to split with thunder, nearly 19 hands tall, withers towering above the highest rail, muscle stacked on muscle, as if the earth had forged him from iron. His mane hung thick, knotted rope swaying with each movement, tail a heavy lash of defiance. Across his flank a scar ran pale and unforgiving, the mark of some heated brand or violent mishap. He did not pace. Instead, he stood as if every inch of earth beneath him belonged to him alone, hooves planted, hindquarters coiled with menace. A hush rippled through the onlookers as his eyes swept over them, dark eyes, unblinking, predatory in their stillness. He struck the rail once, a booming clang that made the pen quiver, and the crowd flinched in unison. A man muttered a curse, and another told him to hush like calming a child near the edge of a cliff. The stallion lifted his head higher, tendons sharp beneath the skin, daring anyone to hold his gaze. Buck Tanner cleared his throat, the microphone catching his voice and grinding it into gravel across the yard. "Lot 14, he said. "Biggest horse to come through these gates in years, and the hardest." He told them of the records of the 3 previous owners who could not hold him, the gates he had demolished, and the handler who still carried broken ribs as testament. His words were not honeyed salesmanship. They were warnings disguised as announcements. The clerk beside him read from the papers with a nervous cadence. Age uncertain, maybe 6. Weight near 2,600 pounds. History of violence, record of injury. Each word seemed to layer iron on the atmosphere until even the wind held back. The first call went out. 1,000 to start. Silence. Someone coughed. The stallion shook his head, mane whipping like storm waves, and struck the rail again. The sound rang like a bell that tolled doom. 800 then, Buck pressed. Still no takers. Boots scuffed the ground, eyes lowered. 6, he tried, the forced cheer in his tone unable to mask the sinking weight of the moment. No response but the wind whistle against the siding. 400. You are stealing him at 4. Faces hardened. A woman near the back shook her head slowly, as if refusing more than the bid itself, refusing the curse tied to it. 300. The number came flat, drained of hope. Even then, no hand lifted. The stallion pawed the earth, and dust rose around his massive legs. He tested the pen as though plotting which line would yield first and which weakness to exploit. Crowd shifted uncomfortably. At a high price, one could tell a story of victory, of taming power. At this low number, it felt only like bargaining with fate, a contract with consequences. Block, the clerk quietly set aside the folder marked for buyers and opened the one labeled Kill. The paper crackled, the sound sharp as a match struck in silence. The stallion's ears twitched toward it, precise, as if he understood the doom inked inside. "Anybody?" Buck asked, his voice softer now, weariness creeping in. "Somebody who knows what they are about." He searched the crowd, finding only avoidance, men suddenly interested in their boots, women fixing eyes on anything but the pen. The air hung heavy. The fate of the great stallion seemed sealed, his path narrowing towards slaughter with each second of silence. The yard felt ready to exhale, to be done with the burden of his presence. Then the gate rattled under another strike of his hoof, steel vibrating under the sheer force, and every heart skipped. The animal's power is undeniable, his fury palpable, his destiny apparently inevitable. Buck looked out one last time, eyes sweeping over the gathered faces, willing someone to step forward. But no hand rose. No voice answered. The giant horse, Lot 14, remained unwanted. Plunge of Cheyenne hung in the air, heavy and final, a judgment passed not by men, but by fear itself. The pen seemed smaller with every breath the stallion took, and every man and woman present felt the truth tightening around them. Unless something impossible happened, the next journey for this beast would not be to a new pasture, but to the shadowed gate where all unwanted animals go. The crowd waited, suspended in dread. The wind pressed against the siding, rattling it like a warning drum, and in the stillness before the hammer of fate could fall, the legend of Aegis, the savage giant horse, balanced on the edge of ruin. The auction yard braced for the inevitable. The curse was alive, and it wore hooves. The yard smelled of dust and sweat and the faint tang of fear that clung to every rail. Buck Tanner rolled his shoulders and let his hat settle lower over his brow, as if he could shield himself from the weight of what was about to happen. The stallion stood like a storm held captive, with its black hide shining where sunlight cut through the overcast sky, muscles trembling with potential violence. He was not pacing like the others had. He was still in the way predators sometimes are, coiled and waiting, a silence more dangerous than noise. The auctioneer's voice came again, louder this time, trying to pierce the wall of hesitation. $1,000, he called. 1,000 for bone and power, 1,000 for a breeder that could sire giants. The crowd shuffled, but no hand rose. The stallion shook his mane, thick ropes whipping, and struck the rail. The clang of iron was so sharp it cut through the moment like a warning. Men stepped back. Women pulled scarves tighter across their shoulders, though the air was not cold. 800, Buck tried, pushing against the tide of silence. 800 for a beast that could anchor a bloodline. Still nothing. Eyes dropped to boots, gravel, to anything that would keep them from meeting the gaze of the animal or the auctioneer. A cough echoed from near the back, a rough sound, as if the man had cleared his throat to fill the void. The stallion stamped, dust rising around his hooves in a small storm, and snorted hard enough to send spit flying. 600, Buck said, with a cheer that felt forced even to him. His voice carried across the speakers, but it had the sound of a man bargaining with ghosts. 600, and still no takers. The crowd was frozen, bound together by a fear no one wanted to name. They had all heard the stories. Gates bent like twigs, men broken beneath hooves, a history of handlers walking away with shattered bones and haunted eyes. To take this horse was to inherit a curse. No bargain price could sweeten the deal. 400, he said, the cheer gone now, voice flat. 400 for lot 14. You are stealing him at 4. He looked to the faces nearest the rail and saw not temptation, but refusal in their eyes. A woman near the back shook her head once, slow and deliberate, her lips pressing together as though sealing away the dangerous thought of saying yes. A man folded his arms tight across his chest, hat low, a gesture of finality. The stallion blew through his nose, the sound like bellows feeding a forge. 300, Buck announced. His words fell heavy and lifeless into the dust. A buyer could have imagined himself clever at 1,000, a man who seized raw power and shaped it into triumph. At 300, it was no longer triumph. It was desperation, a pact with ruin, a gamble that carried more than money on its back. No one spoke, no hand moved. The silence was oppressive, a pressure in the lungs of everyone present. Behind the block, the clerk reached quietly for the folder marked "Kill," reserved for animals destined not for ranches or breeding sheds, but for slaughter. The paper rasped as it was opened, a sound too sharp in the silence, and the stallion flicked an ear toward it, nostrils flaring. His muscles tightened as though even he understood what the sound meant. 200, Buck said. His tone held the fatigue of a man asking a question to which he already knew the answer. 200, gentlemen, 200 for a beast of this size, this presence. Still nothing. The yard was frozen in fear, which was more potent than any ambition. The stallion tested the rails again, his chest pressed against the metal, making bolts creak, making the boys on the gate glance nervously at one another. He turned, eyes flashing, and struck hard with a hind hoof. The vibration rattled up through the posts and into the arms of the crowd. People shifted back another step. The fear became visible now, a living thing in the space between man and animal. Buck's hand trembled on the block. He searched the sea of faces one more time. He knew these people, ranchers, breeders, men and women who had lived their lives around horses. But they could not even gamble on this one. Their eyes told the story. Not worth it. Not at any price. Neither scribbled something quick on the margin of the sheet, his pencil scratching a line that seemed to close the door. Lot 14 is destined for the kill buyer. The phrase itself was a death sentence. The stallion lifted his head higher, ears flicking, and released a roar of neigh that shook the very boards. Dust swirled in the pen, and the echo carried into the hills beyond the yard. It was a sound of defiance, of something too wild to bow even as fate closed in. The crowd flinched again, every face tight with unease. Buck set his jaw. "Anybody," he said, softer now, almost pleading. "Anybody who knows what they are about. Somebody who sees the potential." His words carried, but no one answered. They had already decided, each one of them, that this animal was not a prize, but a death warrant waiting for a signature. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. The only sound was the steady breathing of the stallion, the rasp of air moving through lungs built for endurance. His eyes scanned the crowd, daring, challenging, asking without words if any human dared to stand before him. None did. The wall of fear was complete. Price had fallen like a stone through water, each drop marking the descent into inevitability. From 1,000 down to 200, still no hand raised. Fear had proven more expensive than money. The curse of Cheyenne held fast. The clerk's folder closed with a snap, the sound final. The stallion stamped again, steel ringing, and the crowd exhaled in a single ragged breath as though they had been holding it all along. His fate seemed sealed, a journey not to pastures or to work, but to the shadowed road that ended at slaughter. Position shuffled, murmured, some shaking their heads. A few looked almost relieved, glad the burden of choice was lifted from them. Better for the beast to go to slaughter than to their own land. Better someone else carry the curse. And still, in the pen's center, the stallion stood like a monument to defiance. His chest rose and fell, muscles shifting beneath black hide, eyes like dark mirrors showing the crowd their own fear. He was unwanted, feared, and abandoned by men who prided themselves on toughness. The price had fallen, the crowd had failed, and the wall of fear had been built high and unyielding. The curse had claimed another victim. Unless fate decided to intervene, the savage giant horse would walk the last road no animal deserved. Kang were waited for the gavel to fall, for Buck to end it. The crowd braced for the final sound that would consign Lot 14 to death. The stallion struck again at the rail, and the entire pen shuddered. In that echoing clang, the air felt heavy with doom. The moment had stretched too long. The people had turned away. The curse seemed sealed. And yet the story of Jonah Hale and Aegis had not begun. The auction yard had begun to exhale, as if the whole place had agreed to let the cursed stallion pass quietly into the hands of the kill buyer. Boots shifted, men turned their shoulders, conversations restarted in low mutters about feed prices and the weather, all eager to leave behind the storm they had just witnessed. The clerk tapped the kill folder with a finger, ready to seal it with a signature that would erase the beast from the ledger of the living. Dust swirled in the hard light, and the smell of hay and sweat lingered with an edge of finality. Then a figure moved at the edge of the crowd. He was not loud, not even remarkable at first glance, except that his limp made people turn their heads before their eyes adjusted to the rest of him. Jonah Hale came forward, slowly, a man in his mid-30s with a beard that never grew immensely, patched and stubborn like the man himself. His jeans bore the stains of work that had endured for too long, and his knees were ground with dirt. His jacket was military issue. His elbows were worn smoothly from years of use, and the canvas was faded but sturdy. He carried himself as if weight had been welded to his bones, every step a negotiation with old pain. The limp was the first thing people saw, but it was not the whole of him. His eyes told the deeper story. They were steady without being hard, eyes scanning doorways before walking through them, eyes that had seen comrades and enemies fall, and had never fully learned to rest again. A distance in them belonged to men who had returned from foreign sand and orders, but had left parts of themselves behind. Windshield at the edge of the auction ring, the crowd fell silent again, not because they expected salvation, but because stepping forward had broken the spell of indifference. Heads turned 100 stares bending toward the man who now stood in the hot dust, one hand raised not high, but firm, like a student asking for the floor in a classroom. 150, Jonah said. The words were not shouted, yet they carried. The speakers did not need to repeat them. The sound of that single bid sliced through the air and froze it. Conversation stopped mid-syllable. Boots halted in motion. Even the stallion's ears flicked toward the voice, nostrils quivering at the sudden breath shift around the ring. Buck Tanner tipped his hat back, squinting into the glare to find the source. The crowd parted just enough to show Jonah standing alone, jaw tight, shoulders squared against 100 eyes. "Sir," Buck said into the microphone, his gravelly voice softened almost by instinct. "You know what you are bidding on." "I do," Jonah answered. The murmur that rose was low and dangerous, like the start of a prairie fire hidden under dry grass. "Won't last a week," someone whispered. "He will get himself killed." Another voice carried skepticism that felt like ridicule. "Maybe he thinks he has some trick up his sleeve." Jonah did not turn toward them. His eyes stayed on the stallion. It was not the look of a breaker measuring power, not the calculating glance of a gambler. It was something quieter, something rarer. It was the recognition of another creature wounded by life and scarred into suspicion. Jonah's gaze did not demand surrender. It offered presence. Buck asked for your name and friend, though the sale did not require it. It was not formality, but a moment of recognition, as if even Buck knew this story would need a name to root itself. Jonah Hale. The syllables hung in the air. Buck gave a slow nod as though weighing the man and finding a history he could respect. "Jonah," he said, "I will not sweeten this for you. This horse has broken more than fences. He has put men in hospitals who thought they could read him. He has a mind of his own, which is not gentle. You are sure you want to take that risk?" Jonah's jaw moved once, chewing down whatever memory threatened to surface. His voice was low but firm, steady as a drumbeat when he spoke. I see something in his eyes. It was not bravado, it was not poetry, it was a confession spoken with the cost of years, the kind of sentence that had lived inside him from deserts and bunkers and long nights without answers. He knew what it was to carry rage like armor. He knew what it was to be dismissed as broken. He saw in the stallion a reflection that was more than animal. Stabilized shifted his weight, feathers of his fetlocks stirring dust, eyes locking on Jonah with unblinking focus. For a moment the two figures seemed to hold each other in a mirror no one else could see. Man and beast were bound by an understanding that needed no translation. Buck looked from one to the other. He had seen countless sails and hopeful faces trying to bargain with destiny. But something held a different weight in this moment. He brought the gavel down once, the sharp crack echoing like thunder. "Sold," he declared, "Lot 14 to Mr. Jonah Hale for 150. The yard exhaled in a mixture of relief and disbelief. Some faces carried pity, others morbid curiosity, and a few even gratitude that someone else had taken the curse onto their shoulders. The clerk flipped the folder from kill to sale, the carbon sheet turning blue under the scratch of a stamp, a contract of survival, inked in hurried lines. Jonah stepped closer, signing where required. His handwriting was rough but certain. He did not look up when the clerk muttered the legalities, the waivers, the indemnities. He only listened for the sound of the horse. When he finished, he set the pen down with finality, as though he had also written his own judgment. Neum moved toward the pen, not with rope, whip, or showy gear, but with empty hands open at his sides. He stopped 3 feet from the rail, boots planted, chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. Dust lifted in the small gust between them. The stallion swung his head toward him, blowing out a breath that carried the heat of his lungs into the space between man and metal. 2 impatient stamps shook the earth. The massive neck arched higher, muscles ridging like cables. Jonah did not flinch. He did not shush or coo. He stood, letting the air pass through him like wind move through grass. The crowd held its own breath, waiting for violence and proof of folly. Instead, something subtler occurred. The stallion shifted his skull-heavy head just a fraction, angling it so that both eyes could see Jonah immediately. It was nothing. It was everything. The seed of possibility dropped in silence, unseen but undeniable. A connection had been marked, however faint. The curse that had haunted the yard bent for a heartbeat. The savage giant, unwanted by all, had acknowledged the scarred man who refused to look away. The clerk handed Jonah his copy of the papers. Buck murmured something like "good luck," though it sounded more like a prayer. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers trailing in Jonah's wake. They had witnessed something strange and perhaps reckless, and stories would stretch and bend before the sun set. Jonah remained a moment longer by the rail, eyes steady on the black mountain of horseflesh within. His lips moved once, soundless, as though saying words only he needed to hear. Then he turned, walking back into the glare of the Wyoming sun, the limp pronounced but unashamed. The stallion followed him with his eyes, unblinking, memorizing the shape of the man who had chosen him. The crowd would call it madness. Jonah called it a beginning. The drive back to Jonah Hale's ranch was long and rough, the road that seemed to argue with every wheel turn. The trailer rattled like an old warship battered by waves, its frame complaining against the restless fury inside. Each time the stallion lunged at the divider, the whole rig shuddered, bolts groaning, metal whining. The driver, a weathered man with the patience of the prairie etched into the lines of his face, kept his speed low. He spoke little, his voice slow as his driving. He muttered once that some horses fight the road, but this one fights the world. Jonah sat stiff in the passenger seat, hands clasped in his lap. The ache in his leg pulsed with every jolt, but his mind was far from his body. He kept listening past the hum of tires and the rattle of the trailer, waiting for the rhythm of hooves inside and the sound of impact that might mean the animal had broken loose. He thought of the pen at the yard, the moment when those dark eyes had met his, and how the weight of that gaze had pressed deeper than any battlefield memory. He thought too of the whispers behind him, of the men who muttered that he would not last a week. The truck crested the last rise, and Jonah's land stretched before him. It was not much. It was just patched fences, a low shed that leaned into the wind, and fields dry from weeks without rain. But it was his, earned from years of stubborn labor and saved paychecks. At the far end, a makeshift pen waited, braced with new posts sunk deep and scavenged steel reinforcing the old rails. It looked sturdy enough in daylight, though Jonah knew the stallion would test it before dawn. The trailer backed against the gate, brakes squealing. Jonah opened the passenger door, his boots sinking into the gravel. The air smelled of sage and dry grass, sharp under the fading sun. He moved with care, his limp more noticeable now, each step a reminder of old wounds that had never healed. The driver handed him the clipboard with a faintly sympathetic look. He said he was alive on delivery and at the end of liability. Jonah signed without hesitation. The gate dropped with a metallic clang. There was only silence, heavy and tense for a moment. Like the pause before artillery fire. Then the stallion surged forward, hooves hammering the ramp, massive body exploding into the pen. He stumbled half a step as dirt replaced metal underfoot, then regained balance instantly, throwing his head high, mane whipping like black fire. He shot to the far corner, turned sharply and faced Jonah as though the two had agreed to duel. Dust swirled, the sound of his breathing harsh and defiant. "Water is there," Jonah said, his voice calm, motioning with his chin toward the trough. "Feed when you are ready." He did not step closer. He let the words hang in the air, not as a command, but as a presence. The stallion pressed his chest into the rails, the bolts whining under the strain, then turned, sniffing the unfamiliar scents that hung in the field. He circled tightly, hooves carving his imprint into the dust, and stood as if daring the pen to contain him. Night came on fast. The wind rose, rattling loose tin on the shed, carrying the lonely sounds of the prairie. Jonah sat on the porch, a lantern at his side, eyes fixed on the dark shape moving in the pen. Sleep came in shallow bursts. He woke often to the clang of hooves against steel, each strike ringing like a gunshot. Chickens muttered in their coop, the neighbor's dog barked, and silence returned heavier each time. A new sound split the night, a series of thuds like dominoes falling. Jonah was out of bed in seconds, boots half pulled on, flashlight beam cutting across the field. One corner post leaned dangerously, a brace bent, planks sprang wide. The stallion stood beside it, calm, as though cataloging his victory. No foam, no panic, just a patient destroyer testing weaknesses. Jonah tightened his grip on the flashlight, jaw hard. Morning revealed the damage in full. The feed pan was crumpled flat, 2 posts bent, steel warped from impact. Jonah worked all day to repair, resetting posts, digging deeper, bracing with whatever he could salvage. His shoulders burned, his bad leg throbbed, but his hands never slowed. He spoke aloud while he worked, words meant as much for himself as for the beast. "He is not malicious," he muttered. "He is a horse. He is only a horse." The first week unfolded in rhythm with repairs. Twice the stallion escaped. Once through a latch he should not have been able to manipulate. Once over a rail no horse should have cleared. Both times Jonah tracked him across the land, his heart hammering at the thought of the animal crossing onto neighboring property and of a neighbor finding him before Jonah did. Both times the stallion let himself be turned back without charge, snorting contempt but yielding to the pressure of Jonah's presence. By the end of those days, Jonah leaned against the repaired rails, sweat soaking his shirt, forehead pressed to cool wood. He did not say the word mistake, but it hung like a nail hovering over a board. By the second week, Jonah moved the stallion to a farther pen behind a rise, where fewer sounds reached and fewer people came. He set posts so deep he hit clay, braced them with scavenged steel, and added double chains to the gate. He pushed feed through a gap like an offering slid under a cell door, withdrew his hand before it could be mistaken for a challenge. He said softly, "Not forever, until we know each other better." The stallion flattened his ears and blew hard, flinging hay across the ground before swinging back to eat with heavy poles. His eyes tracked Jonah as he left, sharp and deliberate, missing nothing. At night, Jonah sat awake, listening to the wind worry at the rails, listening for the sound of destruction. Sometimes it came. Sometimes the stallion stood silent, eyes glinting in the dark like coals. Jonah felt the weight of watching, the unspoken truth that this was no ordinary animal. On the fourth morning, a truck turned up the lane, dust trailing. Maggie Torres climbed out, a veterinarian with calm hands and eyes that missed little. She explained that Clint Tanner had called her and said Jonah had bought himself a problem. She walked to the fence, a stethoscope dangling like an ornament and a vet kit in hand. Jonah met her with a rough and brief handshake. She studied the stallion from a distance first, watching how he placed his feet and held his ears. The horse led her into his sightline, then deliberately turned his shoulder, dismissive. "Body looks good," Maggie murmured. "He is too good for what he has been doing. Either too tough to notice pain or too practiced to show it. Can you get near him?" "Not without a mess," Jonah admitted. "Then we do not force it," Maggie replied. "His eyes are telling me enough." "What do they tell you?" Jonah asked. "That people have been the problem," she said, "and the solution has not yet shown up." Her words lingered in the air as she packed her kit. She had not touched the horse or even tried, but her verdict carried weight. "Time," she said finally. "Consistency. Do not go in with a point to prove. Do not go in hungry for a story. Feed when you feed. Water when you water. Be there. Let him decide to be there too." Presumption nodded. He knew that medicine. Time had closed his skin but left his dreams bleeding. He knew the patience of scars. When he did up that evening, as the sun bled across the hills and the stallion's shadow stretched long across the dust, Jonah leaned against the porch rail. He thought of the moment in the auction yard when the eyes of the beast had locked onto him with both orbs at once. He thought of the silence that had passed between them. He thought of his voice, low and certain, saying, "I see something in his eyes." The wind picked up, rattling the tin of the shed. Out in the pen, the stallion blew once, heavy and low, shifting his weight from one hip to another. It was not surrender, it was not trust, but it was something. Jonah lifted his head, pain in his leg forgotten for a moment. He whispered into the twilight, half to himself, half to the great shadow in the pen, "We will make it through this night." And the stallion stood, black against the dying sky, as though he had heard. The dawn came pale and sharp, the kind of Wyoming morning that painted the horizon in thin gold before the sun cleared the hills. Jonah Hale moved slowly across the yard, a bucket in one hand, his limp pronounced from the work of the day before. His boots whispered against the gravel, careful, deliberate. He had learned not to hurry around the stallion. Haste was a predator's language, and he had no wish to remind the beast of predators. The stallion waited in the far corner of the reinforced pen, a black silhouette against the rising light. He did not pace. He did not rear. He watched. His ears tracked Jonah precisely, and his eyes glowed like wells that had seen too much. Jonah set the bucket down through the gap at the bottom rail, never putting his hand inside. He stepped back and lowered himself onto the cottonwood log he had dragged there days earlier, elbows resting on his knees, the breath of the prairie filling his lungs. For a long while there was nothing but wind in the grass and the slow shift of hooves on dirt. The stallion's head was high, his neck arched, every muscle coiled. Jonah did not speak. He had discovered that silence spoke louder than words when trust was at stake. He let the minutes pass until the sun was a fire blade across the field. The stallion edged closer, not in surrender, but in calculation. His nostrils flared, sampling the air that carried Jonah's scent. He snorted once, a harsh exhalation, then lowered his head to the bucket. Jonah watched without moving, every line of his body saying, "I am here, but I am not chasing you." The horse ate slowly, ears flicking, muscles taut. Jonah let his breath fall into rhythm with the sound of hay torn and chewed. When the bucket was empty, the stallion lifted his head and stared at him again. For a moment, man and beast sat locked in a space that seemed to forget the rest of the world. Jonah felt something shift inside him that had been closed since the Desert War, since the nights when explosions had torn holes in the sky and his soul. He recognized the same coiled rage in the animal before him, the same refusal to trust, the same deep wound that could not be bound by rope or rail. Jonah cleared his throat, and his own voice startled him with its honesty. "I know what it feels like to live inside anger," he said. The words came slowly, measured, as if he were reading them off the horizon. "I know what it feels like to think it is all you are." Blindness Alien's ears pricked forward, then eased a fraction. His gaze was still stern, but he was listening. Jonah shifted slightly, looking past the animal toward the line where land met light. He had not meant to speak more, but the words had waited too long inside him. "You are not just that," he said. "Neither am I." After was more profound than before. Jonah let it breathe, let it take shape between them. He looked back and met the stallion's eyes again. Then the sentence came, unplanned like a stone rolling downhill once it had been nudged. "From now on, your name is Valour." The name did not demand. It did not plead. It entered the air and settled like dust on rails, quiet and undeniable. Jonah tasted the word and knew it was as much for him as for the beast. Valour, a reminder disguised as a gift. A word that carried weight from his service, weight from fallen brothers whose names had been rope lines pulled through fire. The stallion did not accept with an obvious sign. What he did was more profound. He stood without moving, then shifted his head just enough to see Jonah with both eyes at once. His breath rose and fell deep in his chest, and then, almost imperceptibly, he tilted his head, a small reset of something vast. Jonah muscle that had stayed tight since the day he hauled the horse home. He did not grin. He did not sigh. He held the moment as gently as a man holds an egg he does not dare crack. The name hung between them, neither celebrated nor contested, but present. In the service, Jonah had learned what names meant. They turned numbers into men. They reminded a soldier of who he was on days when the mud and the blood tried to strip him down to nothing. He had called comrades by their names in craters and bunkers when everything else was chaos, because names anchored souls. Valor was not a boast. It was not a dare. It was a lifeline cast into shared darkness. He rose slowly, ensuring the stallion saw the thought before the movement. He backed away 5 steps, each one deliberate, then picked up the empty bucket. At the corner of the pen, he glanced once over his shoulder. The big horse was still watching, ears forward, eyes softer by degrees, too small for anyone but Jonah to notice. That night, Jonah ate at the counter, with the light fading outside. The stove ticked as it cooled, and in the distance he heard the deep sigh of the stallion, a sound not pretty or eerie, just real. He cupped his hands around his mug, the warmth steady in his palms, and let himself hope in a way that hurt. The days after the naming took on a rhythm. Every morning at 7, every evening at 5, Jonah carried water and hay to the gap. He did not go inside. He did not ask for tricks. He let the sound of his boots, the shape of his coat, and the cadence of his breath become familiar in the stallion's world. On the 5th day after naming, Jonah noticed the first minor change. When he approached, the stallion did not turn its back to him. He stayed oriented, eyes forward. A concession so small it might have meant nothing to anyone else, but it was the shifting of a mountain pebble by pebble to Jonah. The 10th day, another change. Jonah set the bucket down and took 2 steps closer than before. Not much, just enough to test. The stallion's nostrils flared once, then steadied. One ear swiveled back, the other relaxed. He blew softly, not the harsh snort of challenge, but a breath like an animal testing the air for new truth. Jonah let the faintest smile touch his lips, then erased it. The violent snorts became rarer. The angry strikes at the rail diminished. When Jonah spoke a sentence at a time, never a sermon, the stallion's ears tracked the sound. He did not eat in front of Jonah often. Prey animals never surrendered that easily. But he ate soon after, and Jonah counted that as the louder vote. Weeks wrapped around them like a rope. Jonah fixed the pen daily, running his hands along bolts, checking corners for strain. He learned the map of the stallion's comfort, where he liked to stand when the wind was still, and where he avoided it when it came from the north. He learned the rituals, the sniff of new salt, the lick and chew that followed Jonah's retreat, the blink that felt like the edge of a sigh.
One morning, under a sky so pale it seemed carved from ice, the moment arrived without ceremony. Jonah laid a flake of hay near the rail and kept his hand out. The stallion drifted forward, nostrils quivering, and then came 3 more steps until his breath warmed Jonah's knuckles. Jonah whispered, "Hey there," and then shut his mouth before words could ruin it. He lifted his palm slowly, 2 inches above the rail, letting it hover like the lightest question. The stallion lowered his chin, whiskers brushing skin, breath hot and damp against Jonah's hand. Jonah held still, then curved his fingers slightly, resting them against the thick neck where sorrow and pride pooled. Muscle moved beneath his touch, not a flinch, but a ripple like water reshaping around a stone. Jonah matched his pressure to that of a breeze, then a man, who meant every ounce of it. For a heartbeat, horse and man shared a pulse. Jonah withdrew first, not because he had to, but because he wanted the stallion to learn that the end of touch could be as gentle as its beginning. He whispered good into the air, not to command or claim victory, but to honor. The name Valour lingered in the yard, whispered by wind and wire, carried in the rhythm of hooves on dirt, and in Jonah's chest there was space for something other than anger, for the first time in years. The sky had been restless all afternoon, a gray bruise spreading across the horizon, thickening until it seemed to press its weight down on the land itself. The wind prowled along the fence lines, rattling loose boards and whistling through the shed's tin roof. Jonah Hale had watched storms before, but this one carried a different charge, metallic and sharp, the kind of air that made every nerve lean forward in warning. By dusk, the yard looked like a battlefield awaiting its first cannon shot. Branches clawed the eaves. The stovepipe thudded like a drum under each sudden gust. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, boots still on, flashlight within reach. His leg ached from the dampness, and now and then he flexed it to remind himself he still owned it. He waited for the sign that the storm had crossed from threat into danger. When it came, it was not a sound, but a feeling, the sudden certainty that something outside had shifted into peril. He was already moving when the wind slammed against the house, pulling at the screen door until it banged against the siding. He grabbed his coat, heavy flashlight in hand, and stepped into the blow. The air bit with cold, rain just beginning to sting sideways. The smell of ozone and wet earth, harsh and electric, filled his lungs. In prison, Valour was already in motion. The stallion's head was high, tail whipping like a black flag, pacing a tight line along the fence. His ears locked on every creak, his skin rippled with the urgency of flight. He was not panicked yet, but he was close. Too close. The storm's first real punch would push him over the edge. "Easy, boy," Jonah called, though the wind tore apart the words before they reached the pen. He moved as quickly as his bad leg would allow, every step jarring pain through his knee and ankle. The storm found the weakness of the land as surely as the stallion saw the weakness in fences. The roof of the lean-to went first. A crosswind howled down the slope, caught the old structure like a sail, and ripped nails free with a shriek.
Jonah saw the roof lift, wobble, and then tear away entirely, the wall bowing before it shattered outward. Boards cartwheeled into the night, fence wire groaned, and part of the pen sagged under the sudden assault. Jonah had just reached the gate when the beam fell. A heavy crosspiece wrenched free and came down like a hammer, catching him across both shins. His leg folded, and fire shot up to his thigh. He hit the mud hard and pinned, his flashlight tumbling into the dark. Pain swallowed him, white-hot, and the storm pressed in like a predator sensing weakness. Valour bolted toward the gap in the fence, instinct screaming freedom. Jonah saw the massive shape lunge, muscles coiled, black mane flying. Any other horse would have been gone by now, swallowed by the prairie. But the stallion stopped. He stamped once, twice, mud flying, and then turned. He came back. White could hardly breathe. He braced his palms against the beam, shoved with all his strength, but the wood did not budge. His voice came ragged. Valour. The name was ripped thin by the wind, barely audible. The stallion dropped his head, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with the calculation of survival. Then the giant moved. He bunched his shoulders and dropped his massive weight against the beam. The first strike rattled Jonah's bones, but the timber held. Valour backed up, snorted hard, and came again, harder, more precise. This time the beam cracked with a splintering pop. Jonah yanked his legs free, rolling aside as another gust flung rain like stones across the yard. His ankle screamed with pain, but he could move. Valour's head came down close, breath hot with the sour metallic tang of adrenaline. Jonah gasped, "Good boy, good!" Though the storm swallowed most of the words, the horse stood close enough to feel them. Their exhales mingled in the narrow space between man and beast, both steaming in the cold night. Jonah staggered to his feet, leaning against the fence, his leg barely holding. The wind drove at him like an enemy charge, rain stinging his face. Valour pressed near, hooves steady in the mud, his great body forming a shield against the gale. Jonah moved toward the shelter of the smaller lean-to by the house, and the stallion followed, shoulder to shoulder, breaking the storm's teeth for him. Flooding, they reached the narrow overhang, the corrugated roof thrumming under the downpour. The space was hardly wide enough for both, but Valour shouldered in beside him without a flicker of the hostility that once defined him. Jonah pressed his side against the stallion's barrel, feeling muscle tremor under wet hide, not fear, but tension coiled and ready. Valour's breath warmed the damp hair at his temple, pulsing steady, anchoring. "You just saved my life," Jonah whispered. The words were quiet, meant only for the storm and the stallion, but they carried weight. Valour did not move away. He stood, eyes on the shifting dark beyond, ears flicking but body still. Jonah's hand found his neck and rested there, and for the first time the horse did not resist. The storm roared around them for an hour, tearing branches, scattering debris, and rattling every weak place in the yard. But within the narrow shelter, man and beast held steady together, pressed into the same small refuge. Jonah's pain flared each time he shifted his weight, but it was dulled by the heat of the stallion, by the fact that he was alive because the animal had chosen to come back. When the gusts finally softened, when the thunder rolled farther and the lightning thinned, Jonah's body sagged with exhaustion. He led Valour toward the smaller pen by the house, his limp exaggerated, his ankle swollen, but his hand steady on the rope. The stallion followed without slack, hooves picking careful paths through the wreckage. Inside the pen, Jonah latched the gate and turned. Valour watched him with a focus that was no longer the cold fury of Cheyenne, but something deeper, something shared. Jonah whispered again, "We are not strangers anymore." Morning revealed the yard wrecked, boards strewn, wire twisted, the shelter ripped apart. But in the pen, Valour stood calm, eyes soft, ears easy, the rage no longer the only story written across his frame. By noon, trucks arrived, drawn by word of the storm and rumor of what had happened. Buck Tanner stepped out, his oilskin coat still dripping. Hank Morrison followed, suspicion and pride sharpening his face. They expected to find Jonah broken or the horse gone. Instead, they found them standing together. Jonah looped a rope gently over Valour's neck and slid it into place without struggle. The stallion flicked an ear but did not resist. He even lowered his muzzle to nudge Jonah's shoulder, a touch light but deliberate. Hank stopped mid-curse, eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered. Maggie's vet truck came next. She walked a slow circle around the stallion, eyes sharp. "No cuts, no swelling," she noted. Eyes soft, no flare in the nostrils, muscles loosen. "That's not a horse on guard anymore." She looked at Jonah and said, "That's trust. Slow, built in silence, rare as anything I've seen." The story spread faster than the storm itself. By evening, the town was telling it in half a dozen versions. In some, Valour had smashed his own pen to reach Jonah. In others, he had stood guard all night, shielding him from the wind. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Jonah now leaned closer, curious. They spoke of the killer horse who had saved his owner, a phrase passed like a ballad. Jonah wanted none of the spotlight, but he understood its usefulness. If people came expecting a monster and found a steady animal with a calm eye instead, the legend could be reshaped into something valuable. Night, Jonah sat on the porch, leg wrapped, pain still biting but bearable. Valour grazed quietly in the pen, tail flicking against the cooling evening air. Jonah thought of the moment when the stallion turned back and chose to return instead of fleeing into the dark. He thought of the beam shifting, of freedom earned by shared strength. He thought of the touch on his shoulder, light and deliberate, more potent than any roar. The storm had tested both of them, and in surviving it together, they had crossed a line neither would have believed possible. From now on, Jonah knew there would be more storms. Fences would fall again. The work would never end. But they would face it not as strangers or enemies, but as two beings who had chosen each other against every expectation. The prairie night settled quietly around them. Jonah leaned back, letting the pain of his body soften under the weight of that truth. Valour lifted his head in the pen and blew out softly, a sound carried across the yard like a promise. The storm had left scars across the ranch, broken boards scattered in the grass, twisted wire gleaming dull in the morning sun. Jonah Hale walked the yard with a heavier limp than usual, one hand resting on his thigh as if to hold the pain in place. His ankle throbbed like fire, and every step reminded him of the beam nearly ending him. Yet even through the ache, there was a steadiness he had not felt before. Valour trailed along the fence line inside the smaller pen near the house, ears swiveling, his body calm in a way Jonah had never seen. By the third morning after the storm, neighbors began to drive by, slow trucks idling on the gravel road, faces craning to catch sight of the beast that had returned instead of running. Word had grown like wildfire in prairie grass. Some said the horse had smashed the beam with a single strike. Others swore he had stood guard over Jonah until the thunder moved on. Stories were already taller than truth, but none erased that the stallion was still here and Jonah was alive because of him. Hank Morrison arrived first, climbing out of his truck with suspicion written deep in his face. He leaned on the fence, eyes narrowed. He muttered, "You'll forgive me if I don't clap, but I never thought I'd see the day that animal let a man walk beside him." Jonah did not rise to the bait. He coiled the rope in his hands, stepped into the pen, and slipped the loop over Valour's neck. The stallion flicked one ear, then lowered his muzzle to nudge Jonah's shoulder in a more exploratory than hostile touch. Hank's mouth opened, then closed again. "Son of a gun," he whispered, as if speaking louder would shatter the spell. Later that morning, Maggie Torres drove up, her vet truck rattling across the yard. She carried her kit but left it closed on the tailgate, choosing instead to watch. She circled Valour, studying every angle. "Her eyes are soft," she said. "Her nostrils are easy, and her muscles are loose. That's not the same horse you bought, Jonah." Jonah shook his head. "Feels like the same one. Just translated." Maggie smiled at that, a quick flash of teeth, then sobered. "Keep doing what you're doing. The worst mistakes come when you think the movie's over." The town did not let the story rest. By the week's end, people who had once whispered curses about Jonah's foolish purchase now angled to catch a glimpse. Some brought their children, some brought questions, and others only brought curiosity.
disguised as errands. The phrase "killer horse that saved his owner" was repeated in shops, the feed store, and the cafe. Jonah disliked the attention, but he also saw its weight. Legends could be reshaped, and perhaps this one could be turned from a curse into a blessing. Clint Rollins appeared on a Saturday, hat pulled low, his stride carrying the easy authority of a man who had worked auctions his entire life. He stood by the fence while Jonah brushed Valour's flank with deliberate strokes. The stallion shifted, but did not resist, his tail swishing in rhythm with the strokes. Clint cleared his throat. "That's the hardest horse I've ever sold," he said.
"I didn't believe it when I was told the right hands might make something of him. I do now." He tipped his hat toward Jonah, the gesture as close to a salute as he gave. Valour's changes grew in layers, like the prairie sky shifting from storm to calm. His eyes softened until the whites no longer flashed with every sound. His muscles no longer braced against invisible blows. He stood sometimes at the gate waiting, ears forward, his gaze steady but not cold. Jonah noticed the small things most. The horse was chewing slowly, instead of flinging hay across the pen. The way his ears tilted toward Jonah's voice, tracking words as if they mattered, the subtle tilt of his head when Jonah lingered by the rail at dusk. One evening, children arrived with their parents, a family from the next farm. They stood at the gate, hesitant, the children clutching their mother's hands. Jonah approached with caution. "Not today," he said, voice gentle. "He's not ready for that yet."
But the stallion had other ideas. Valour stepped forward, his massive frame filling the gap, and lowered his head. The little girl in yellow stretched out her palm, trembling. Jonah nearly stopped her, but Valour breathed softly, nostrils fluttering, and let her touch his cheek. Her mother gasped, tears in her eyes. Valour did not flinch. He stood as if he had decided this small and fragile human was safe to know. By the end of summer, the silhouette of man and horse moving along the fence line became a familiar sight. With his limp, Jonah steadied his stride, and Valour walked beside him with a lead rope loose enough to be almost decorative. Neighbors waved from truck windows, lifted chins in acknowledgement. Children called him the gentle giant, and the name stuck, spreading through the county like pollen on the wind. At the county fair, the invitation came. Clint explained that a second chance showcase was a corner of the fairground for animals that had been written off but found new paths. Jonah hesitated, wary of crowds undoing months of patient work. But Maggie's steady look convinced him. "We can try," she said. "Just remember, you set the rules." On the fair day, Jonah loaded Valour with deliberate calm, speaking softly, letting the stallion smell every piece of tack. They drove in before the crowds gathered, the horse stepping into the shade of the education tent with wary eyes but steady legs. The fairground smelled of diesel, sugar, and sweat. Children darted in bright packs. Music thumped from the bandstand. Valour stood, ears swiveling, but he did not bolt. A line formed without being called. "Can we?" a boy asked, fingers hovering near the stallion's forelock. "Not yet," Jonah said. He waited until the boy's energy stilled, then nodded. "Now." On the one hand, slow. The boy touched, reverent, and Valour lowered his head a fraction. Gasps and whispers rippled through the line. A girl in a yellow shirt pressed her palm against his cheek and whispered something private, her mother swallowing hard behind her. Adults asked questions. Could he be ridden? Would Jonah breed him? What were the first days like? Jonah answered steadily, without flourish. "He wasn't mine the day I bought him," he said. "I wasn't there the night of the storm. We chose each other 100 small times after that." The crowd nodded, some blinking away tears, others quiet with thought. Pedestrians called from behind. "Show us something." Jonah lifted his hand and opened his fingers. Valour took one step forward and stopped. Jonah turned his shoulder, and the stallion swung his hips left in a slow, controlled arc. Another gesture, and Valour dropped his head to his wither height, calm as a drawbridge lowering. "It's not tricks," Jonah said.
It's a conversation we've been having for a while." The applause was soft but real, rising over the hum of the fairground. Valour flicked an ear but stayed calm. The legend of the savage horse had shifted again, bent into something softer, hopeful. That night, back at the ranch, Jonah sat on the porch, his ankle aching, his heart oddly light. Valour grazed near the fence, tail swishing lazily. Jonah thought of the names the town had given him: Killer Horse, Shy Devil, Curse of Cheyenne, and now, Gentle Giant. The words were only words, but they carried the weight of people's beliefs. Jonah knew the truth. Valour was not gentle, not really. He was powerful and dangerous when wronged, and a storm held in his muscles and bones. But he had chosen, again and again, to stay, to turn back instead of running, to stand beside instead of striking. And perhaps that was the gentleness of a kind. The prairie night thickened, cicadas buzzing in the dark. Jonah leaned back in his chair and let the horse's breathing carry across the yard. Wind shifted somewhere beyond the hills, promising more weather and trials. But for now, the story was this: a man and a horse who had been written off, finding each other in the broken spaces, reshaping legend into truth. The gentle giant was no longer a myth or a warning. He was flesh and blood, hooves on dirt, breath in the dark, and he was Jonah's, not owned, not conquered, but shared. In that quiet, with the fair behind them and the town beginning to believe, Jonah felt something close to peace. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the corral, the dust not yet stirred by hooves or boots. Jonah Hale leaned against the fence post, rope coiled loosely in his hands, waiting for the first of the trucks to arrive. Valour stood in the far corner of the pen, head low but ears flicking, watching the quiet assembly of this new day. It was not a fairground now, not a crowd hungry for spectacle, but a gathering meant for something smaller and more challenging to measure: the slow rebuilding of trust between people and animals that had lost their way. By mid-morning, they began to come. A woman with a nervous Mustang, her face lined with the kind of patience forged in hardship. A young man leads a mule with scars from some old cruelty across its flank, an older rancher with a gelding that shied at every sudden sound. They filed into the corral slowly, voices lowered, each carrying the weight of animals written off by someone else. Maggie Torres arrived with her vet kit, though she left it closed on the tailgate, choosing to watch with sharp, steady eyes instead. Clint Rollins leaned on the rail, arms crossed, his weathered face set in its usual unreadable mask, though his eyes followed every move Jonah made. Jonah began without fanfare. He stood in the center of the corral, rope loose at his side, and let Valour drift closer, then away. No commands, sharp gestures, just presence. "You start by not cornering an animal you've already taught to fear corners," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the group. "You give him an out. He learns you're not the trap. Then you ask for small things, weighable things, winnable things." Valour circled once, stopped with his head angled toward Jonah. The man lifted a hand, fingers open. The horse shifted his weight, a single step forward, then stopped. Jonah nodded, the motion deliberate, slow. "That's it," he said softly. "You don't ask for the mountain on day one, you ask for a foothold." Antlers watched, some skeptical, some hopeful. Jonah motioned for them to bring their animals inside, one at a time. A young woman with the Mustang stepped forward, her breath shallow, her eyes flicking between Jonah and the dark horse at her side. Jonah guided her without taking the rope. "Stand where you can be seen," he said. "Let him look at you. Don't sneak. Sneaky makes prey nervous." She obeyed, slow, hands trembling. The Mustang snorted, ears pinning, but then relaxed half a notch when the woman stepped back instead of forward. Jonah nodded. That's how it starts, respect given before it's earned back. Sam Walker leaned against his truck, sipping coffee, eyes soft with something close to awe. He had hauled horses all his life, seen every stubborn, scared, and broken, but he had never seen a man stand so quietly and make the air itself an ally.
When Jonah lifted the rope and let it fall again without using it, Sam muttered, "Bless me, that's something rare. Submerged with barrels first, halters slipping over plastic instead of flesh." Jonah made them repeat until their hands steadied, until their voices found calm. Then they moved back to living animals. The mule flinched at first, eyes rolling white. But Jonah reminded the handler to breathe, to let the rope be a suggestion instead of a chain. Inch by inch, the mule stopped bracing and began to listen. The gelding, so quick to shy, lowered his head by the third try, ears easing forward. The Mustang licked and chewed, the first sign of a wall beginning to crack. Maggie watched with arms folded, her sharp gaze softening only once, when a woman cried quietly after her horse touched its nose to her knuckles and stayed there. Jonah said that's what time does, his words cutting through the quiet. Time and fairness. You'll hate it at first. Feels like nothing's happening. But if nothing's happening, you're probably doing it right. By afternoon, the sun pressed hard, baking the corral, but no one left. They stood and watched as Valour took slow steps under Jonah's guidance. Not tricks, but conversations in motion. A shift of the man's shoulder sent the stallion swinging left. A soft rope tap against his thigh dropped the horse's head. No fight, no spectacle, only the steady rhythm of patience. Afterwards, when the handlers gathered near the fence, Jonah spoke plainly. "Don't chase miracles," he told them. "Miracles come when you're not asking for them. Chase small, honest things. Water in the bucket, hay in the trough, a step toward, instead of away. That's how you build the rope you'll need later." They nodded, some wiping dust and sweat from their brows, others still holding on to the warmth of the small breakthroughs they had just seen. Valour stood nearby, sweat darkening his flanks, but his eyes calm, ears relaxed. He had become not the monster they had feared, but the proof that even the worst stories could be rewritten. The following self-invited farther than he had planned to go. A sanctuary east of Pine Bluffs asked him to visit, and a rescue group in Laramie wanted him to speak. He resisted at first, wary of turning Valour into a spectacle, but Maggie reminded him that sometimes the story could heal more than medicine. If people came expecting a curse and left with a lesson, wasn't that worth it? The first school visit was the hardest. Fourth graders with clipboards, their eyes wide with the kind of curiosity that does not know limits. They circled Valour on the blacktop, their voices tumbling over each other. "Does he get scared?" one boy asked. "Of course," Jonah said. "He just learned what to do with it, same as people." A girl raised her hand. "Is he the biggest horse in the world?" Jonah smiled. "Not even close." The class laughed, and Valour stood with ears swiveling, unbothered. He let the children approach individually, teaching them to be honest with their bodies, move slowly, and let the horse see them. When a boy in a Bronco sweatshirt laid his hand against Valour's muzzle, the stallion lowered his head just enough for the boy to feel tall. The teachers watched from the steps, their faces thoughtful. Later, when they gathered the class to talk about second chances, Jonah stayed by the chain-link fence, rope slack in his hand, listening to the children's stories of dogs adopted from shelters, brothers who had stumbled and returned stronger. By autumn, the story had outgrown Jonah's control. Churches spoke of it in sermons, cafes in whispers, ranchers in straightforward nods. A horse once cursed had become a symbol of grace, patience, and second chances. Jonah never claimed the title for himself. He only kept showing up, feed bucket in one hand, rope in the other, body steady, voice plain. Valour, the gentle giant, became part of the landscape, known as the wind and the dust, not tamed, not broken, but understood. And that was enough. One evening, as Jonah sat on the porch with his legs stretched stiffly before him, watching the horizon bleed into twilight, he thought of the workshop,
the corral filled with hesitant people and hesitant animals, each testing whether trust could still be built. He thought of the little girl in yellow whispering something private against Valour's cheek, the Mustang licking and chewing for the first time, and the mule standing without bracing. He thought of the storm, the beam, and the horse's hot breath that had saved him. He thought of all the small choices that had carried them from curse to gentle giant. And he realized, with a clarity that cut deeper than any pain in his leg, that the story was no longer about survival. It was about teaching others to choose the same quiet work and to believe in second chances. Not because they were guaranteed, but because sometimes, against every odd, they held. The prairie darkened, cicadas rising in chorus, the night settling over the ranch. In the pen, Valour raised his head, ears flicking toward Jonah, then blew out a long, steady breath, as if to agree with the thought. The sky that afternoon had worn a shade of gray that felt sickly, a heavy quilt pressing down on the plains. Jonah Hale thought it in his bones before he saw it in the clouds. The limp in his leg dragged harder, his ankle stiff from the old storm wound. Valour paced the fence line, ears flicking at every low rumble far off, the air already thick with a metallic tang of ozone. Horses know before men, Jonah whispered to himself, watching the stallion's restless circle. By dusk, the wind had gathered an army at the edges of the land. Branches clawed at the house siding, the stove pipe thudded like a drum, and the old lean-to out by the far pen groaned with every gust. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, boots still on, flashlight within reach, waiting for the moment he knew would come. The storm did not arrive with sound first, but with a sharp shift in the air that cut across his skin. Something outside tipped from tense to dangerous. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, stepping into the gale. The cold slapped him hard, the kind of wind that carried grit sharp enough to sting. Valour was already moving at the pen, head high, tail lashing, his massive body tracing a tight line along the back rail. Jonah called to him, voice lost in the roar. The smell of the storm was undeniable now, a promise of violence about to break. The crosswind hit without warning. One moment, the world was holding its breath. The next, the lean-to tore apart like paper in a child's hands. Nails shrieked loose. Timbers cracked like gunshots. A beam came down in the sweep of Jonah's flashlight. He had no time to move. It struck him across the shins, folding him into the mud. Pain shot through him like lightning, white and blinding, his voice escaping in a ragged cry. Valour bolted at the collapse, black against black, charging toward the open gap in the fence where boards had splintered away. Instinct screamed freedom. The prairie yawned wide, the storm winds calling him out into the endless dark. Jonah braced against the beam, pushing with every shred of strength, but the timber would not budge. He shouted, a broken thread of sound swallowed by thunder. And then the impossible happened. Valour skidded to a halt at the gap, mud spraying from his hooves. His head swung, nostrils flaring, and in 2 stamping strides he turned back. Jonah saw the massive shape lunge toward him, eyes blazing not with fury but with something else. The stallion lowered his chest and drove it into the beam. The first hit rattled it loose, but not enough. He stepped back, snorted, then came again, harder. Shoulders bunched like mountains crashing forward. Wood splintered in a burst sharp as rifle fire. The beam cracked and rolled, freeing Jonah's legs. Jonah dragged himself out, pain flaring in his ankle, but he could move. Valour's head dropped close so that near Jonah could smell the hot, sweet, sour smell of his breath.
Good boy,
Jonah gasped, though the storm swallowed the words. Their exhales mingled in the narrow space between man and beast. Rain came hard now, sideways, needles of water driven by a wind that staggered him when he tried to stand. Valour pressed close, his bulk breaking the worst of it. Together, they lurched toward the barn, Jonah leaning on the fence, Valour circling him with glances outward, like a sentry keeping both watch and guard. The lean-to was gone. Boards cartwheeled into the night. The smaller overhang by the barn still stood, and they crowded beneath it, both soaked through, the roof thrumming with the steady drum of rain. Jonah pressed his hand against Valour's flank, feeling muscle tremors. He was not afraid now, but felt tension held for use.
The stallion's breath moved the wet hair at Jonah's temple. Jonah said, "You just saved my life." The words rough and certain. Valour stood without flinching, ears forward, eyes fixed on the storm's horizon. The thunder rolled away by degrees, the lightning growing distant, but the wind rattled on, testing every weakness in the yard. Jonah's ankle burned like fire when the worst had passed, but it held his weight. He led Valour toward the smaller pen by the house, the rope slack, the horse following without resistance. Inside the gate, Jonah turned. The eyes looking back at him were not the wild, blind fury of the auction yard. They were alert but steady, fixed not on escape, but on the man who stood before him. "From here on," Jonah said softly, "we're not strangers anymore." Unquestion was pale and slow. The clouds wrung dry but still heavy in the sky. The yard bore the storm's wreckage, twisted boards, bent wire, a trash can lid rolling lazily in the breeze. Jonah knelt at the broken pen, one hand massaging his ankle, the other setting a crossbar back in place. Gravel crunched behind him, tires on wet stone. He looked up to see a battered stock truck pull in. Clint Rollins climbing out first, Hank Morrison behind him, both men wearing the grim expressions of those who expect to find disaster. "Heard you had a hell of a night," Clint said, scanning the wreckage. Hank's eyes went straight to the pen. "Figured we'd find you laid up, or worse," he said flatly. They had come for confirmation, expecting to see a man or a horse finished. Jonah said nothing, only nodded toward the corner where Valour stood, head over the rail watching the arrivals. Slowly, Jonah stepped inside, rope coiled in his hand. He slipped it over Valour's neck without hurry, without display. The stallion flicked an ear, then dropped his muzzle to Jonah's shoulder in a quiet, exploratory touch. Hank stopped mid-sentence, eyes wide. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered. That horse never let a man close without trying to take his head off. Moments later, Maggie's vet truck rolled in. She took in the wreckage, the calm horse, the mud still on Jonah's coat. She circled Valour once, checking for cuts or swelling. Her eyes are soft, and she noted no flare in the nostrils, muscles loosen in the neck. That's not a horse on guard anymore. Clint folded his arms, his gravelly voice steady. "What's your read, Doc?" "My read," she said, "is you're looking at the product of slow trust. No halter fights, no ropes, no fear pressed into his hide. Just time, presence, and a man who wouldn't quit. Rare. And with a horse this far gone, nearly unheard of." By noon, the story had already spread beyond the ranch. In town, it grew with each telling. Some said Valour smashed the beam alone to save Jonah. Others claimed he stood over him through the storm, a black sentinel against the thunder. Each version made the horse larger and braver, the night colder, and the danger worse. At the cafe, they whispered it like a ballad, the killer horse that saved his owner. Jonah wanted no part of legend, but he could see the opening it offered. If people came seeking the monster and found a working animal with steady eyes and a calm step instead, the story could be bent into something useful. That evening, sitting on the porch, with his ankle wrapped and his body aching, Jonah watched Valour graze along the fence line, tail flicking lazily. He thought of the storm, the beam that had nearly crushed him, and the breath they had shared in the shelter. He thought of Hank's disbelief, Maggie's nod, and Clint's silence. He thought of the 100 small moments that had carried them from the auction yard to this morning after. He said into the quiet, "I'm not ready to quit." Valour lifted his head in the field at the sound, ears forward, then blew out a long breath that drifted across the yard. It was not an answer in any language men use. But to Jonah it sounded enough like agreement. By late summer, the storm that nearly broke Jonah's ranch had already become legend in Cheyenne. At the feed store, men leaned on counters retelling it with gestures that grew broader by the week. At the cafe, servers lowered their voices when newcomers asked about the giant black stallion, their tone a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Some said Valour had smashed through the wreckage like a knight breaking chains to free his master. Others insisted he had stood guard all night, shielding Jonah with his massive body while the storm raged. The truth shifted like dust in the wind, but in every telling the horse grew larger and braver, and Jonah became the man who had somehow turned a devil into a guardian.
Jonah hated gossip, but he recognized the opportunity it carried. If people came expecting to see a monster and left having met a working horse with a steady eye and calm step, the town could learn something. Valour had become part of the weather, as familiar as the wind sweeping the plains. But Jonah knew stories mattered here. They carried weight heavier than stone, especially where silence and suspicion were the usual currencies. The first real test came at the county fair. Maggie Torres was the one who brought him the invitation, folded in half, her finger tapping the name scrawled at the bottom. "They want you in the second chance showcase," she said. "Small corner, nothing loud, just you and Valour. Let people see what patience looks like." Jonah frowned, rubbing at the stiffness in his ankle. "Crowds could undo months of work," he said. "A single child screaming, a hand reaching too fast, and we're back where we started." Maggie met his eyes. "Or you prove to them he's not what they thought. You set the rules." So they went. The fairground smelled of sugar, diesel, and livestock sweat. Music bled from the bandstand, mixing with the shouts of children darting in packs. Jonah led Valour to the shade of the education tent before the crowds thickened. The stallion's head was high, ears swiveling, but he did not surge or spook. He stood, massive and black against the dust-bright backdrop, watching everything with the still intensity of an old soldier. Word traveled fast, a line formed without anyone calling it a line. The first was a boy with hair sticking up like straw, his hand hovering an inch from Valour's forelock. "Not yet," Jonah said quietly. "He doesn't know you." The boy's eyes widened. Then he forced his energy down, his shoulders settling. Jonah nodded. Now, slowly, one hand. The boy reached, palm trembling, and touched the broad black cheek. Valour did not move. The boy's mother swallowed hard, and Jonah knew she would remember that moment longer than her son. More children came, more cautious hands. A little girl whispered something private against Valour's muzzle, her words lost in the noise of the fair, but transparent enough in her eyes. A teenager crouched, marveling at the thick feathers around the stallion's ankles, reverence in his voice. Adults asked questions, whether he could be ridden, whether Jonah would breed him, what those first days had been like. Jonah answered steadily, never romanticizing, never preaching. "He wasn't mine the day I bought him," he said. "I wasn't here the night he broke that beam. We chose each other 100 small times after." The crowd nodded as if the truth was obvious once spoken, but Jonah knew most had never believed such a thing was possible. Fair, the phone began to ring. A rescue group in Laramie wanted him for a workshop. A sanctuary east of Pine Bluffs asked if he would bring Valour to show what patience could achieve. Schools called. Teachers quickly recognized a lesson when it walked on 4 legs. Jonah resisted at first, but he remembered Maggie's words. Sometimes the story heals more than medicine. A dozen handlers stood in the corral at the first workshop with their troubled horses. Jonah spoke little. He showed them instead, standing steady with Valour, letting the stallion drift close and away, the rope slack, the air calm. "You start by not cornering him," Jonah said. "You give him an out. Then you ask for something small, winnable." They practiced on barrels before moving to horses. The mule flinched, the Mustang snorted, the gelding shied, but slowly, quietly, they began to soften. A woman cried when her Mustang finally touched its nose to her hand. Jonah only nodded. That's what time does. Stories spread again, faster than Jonah could contain it.
At the school, children wrote essays about second chances, some about their dogs, some about brothers who had stumbled and returned. At churches, Valour's name was mentioned in sermons about grace. In cafes, strangers approached Jonah with handshakes, no longer avoiding his eyes. Clint Rollins made his own public declaration at a fundraiser in town. Standing in front of a room that had heard his voice sell everything from saddles to colts, he took off his hat and said, "I told the truth that day at the auction. He was the hardest horse I'd ever seen. I also said the right hands could make something of him. I didn't believe it then. I do now." The room applauded, and some clapped Jonah's shoulder afterwards. Jonah felt the weight of suspicion lift from him for the first time in years. Yet, for all the public praise, Jonah valued the ordinary moments more, the quiet mornings when Valour's breath hung like steam in the cold air. When the stallion walked the fence line beside him in the evenings, he did so not because of rope or command, but because he chose to. The way people waved from truck windows when they saw the silhouette of a man and a horse moving together across the fields. Children began calling him the Gentle Giant, a nickname that traveled without malice, layering a softer truth over the old one. Sitting on the porch with his coffee cooling beside him one afternoon, Jonah thought about how far they had come. No one wanted to go from the cursed stallion to the horse that children now reached for with open hands. He thought of the storm, beam, and breath they had shared in the dark. He thought of the workshops, the classrooms, the ranchers who now nodded instead of scoffing. Valour grazed 50 yards out, tail flicking lazily. Jonah watched him, the great black shape moving with unhurried confidence. He then realized that the story was no longer just about the horse. It was about him too, learning to show up every day and refusing to quit even when quitting seemed easier. The town had changed. The horse had changed. And so had Jonah. The evening light settled over the ranch, soft gold brushing every fence post and weed. Valour lifted his head once, chewing slowly, and met Jonah's eyes. "We made it this far," Jonah whispered. Calm and steady, the stallion blew out a long breath and lowered his head again to graze. The work would continue, but now it was no longer just survival. It belonged. The season's first frost painted the grass silver, each blade stiff beneath the early light. Jonah Hale stood on the porch, mug of coffee warming his hands, his breath rising in slow curls. Across the pasture, Valour grazed, black against the pale field, his coat catching the dawn like polished stone. Months had passed since the night of the storm, and though the memory of pain still lingered in Jonah's ankle, he moved with a steadier gait. He had learned to measure his days by the rhythm of feeding, mending, and walking the fence line with a horse that had once been his enemy. The town had shifted too. Where once people crossed the street to avoid him, now they waved. Where once Valour's name was whispered with dread, now children shouted it across playgrounds, their voices filled with pride, as if claiming kinship with the great black stallion. Yet Jonah never let himself forget what it had taken to get here. Patience was not a trick you pulled from your pocket. It was work, slow and relentless, the kind of work most people never stayed with long enough to see its reward. On that particular morning, though, Jonah felt something different, a tug beneath his ribs, an idea forming before he could speak it. He watched Valour lift his head, ears swiveling toward him. The stallion stood square, calm but alert, the kind of posture that spoke of readiness. Jonah set the mug down and walked into the field. Valour met him halfway, not rushing but not retreating either. Jonah laid a hand against the broad neck, feeling the warmth of muscle, the slow rise and fall of breath. He had touched him many times, brushed the dust from his coat, and buckled a halter without resistance. But today he carried the saddle from the shed, leather worn and creaking with memories of other horses, other days. He laid it across the rail first, letting the smell of oiled leather drift into the air. Valour flicked an ear, nostrils twitching, but did not move away. Jonah took his time, running the pad across the horse's back with slow, even strokes. Valour shifted his weight once, muscles tensing, then easing. The saddle followed, set gently, with no sudden movements and no command hidden in the act. The cinch tightened, notch by notch, Jonah humming low beneath his breath, an old tune from his father's days. When it was done, Valour stood steady, his great head turned just enough to watch but not resist.
Jonah placed his hand on the horn, testing the balance, the leather groaning softly. He did not mount right away. Instead, he walked Valour in a slow circle. The stallion's stride measured, the rhythm of his hooves a drumbeat in the quiet morning. Jonah felt his heart hammer, not from fear but from the moment's weight. Trust was not something you declared, it was something you stepped into together. He slid his boot into the stirrup, moving with the deliberate care he had once used to disarm explosives overseas. The leather creaked, Valour's ears flicked back, then forward again. Jonah swung up, settling into the saddle, his weight balanced, hands light on the reins. For a moment, the world stilled. Valour did not rear, did not bolt. He breathed long and steady, and Jonah breathed with him. Small, cautious, and each question was asked and answered. Jonah pressed lightly with his heel, and Valour moved forward, his stride powerful but calm. They sickled the pen once, twice, the sound of hooves steady on packed earth. Jonah felt the horse beneath him, not as a beast to control, but as a partner carrying him. Every shift of weight, every breath was a conversation. The sun had lifted higher when they stepped beyond the pen, throwing gold across the fields. Jonah guided Valour toward the rise at the far edge of the property. The stallion's ears toggled between the horizon and the man on his back, between the call of the open land and the quiet command of trust. Jonah let the reins lengthen, giving the horse room to choose. Valour walked steadily, not rushing, not testing the limits. Through the crest of the hill, they paused. The land unfolded in every direction, fences running like lines on an old map, the creek bed glinting faintly with the last of the season's water. Jonah sat quietly, his chest loosening with each breath. His ankle ached, his shoulder throbbed from old wounds, but the weight felt smaller than the sky above him for the first time in years. They moved down the slope, the rhythm of 4 hooves striking a cadence that matched the beat of Jonah's heart. He spoke softly, words carried on the wind. Not everyone gets lucky enough to find a reason to keep going. You and me, we did. Valour flicked an ear back, then forward, as if acknowledging the sound. The ride was not dramatic. There were no leaps, no gallops, no crowds to witness it. But it was everything. The small negotiations of balance and trust, how Valour responded to the slightest shift, and how Jonah's body remembered how to move in rhythm with another living thing. It was a revelation for a man who had once believed himself broken beyond repair. By the time they returned to the yard, the sun had begun to soften, the shadows stretching long across the grass. Jonah dismounted slowly, patting Valour's neck, feeling the solid warmth beneath his palm. He loosened the cinch, slid the saddle off, and laid it across the rail. Valour did not bolt, did not snort in defiance. He lowered his head to graze, tail flicking lazily, as if the ride had been nothing unusual. Jonah sat on the fence's top rail, boots hooked beneath the slats, watching the big black shape move in the fading light. The town might call it a miracle. They might weave legends about the cursed horse redeemed by a broken soldier, but Jonah knew the truth was more straightforward and more complex. It was work. It showed up daily, feeding, mending, waiting, not demanding proof. The slow accumulation of moments built into something neither of them could have achieved alone. The boy at the fair, the little girl whispering secrets into Valour's ear, the handlers at the workshop crying when their horses touched them for the first time. He thought of Maggie's steady eyes,
Clint's public words, Hank's grudging respect, he thought of the storm, the beam that had nearly crushed him, and the breath they shared in the dark shelter. The horse had changed. The town had changed. But most of all, Jonah had changed. He no longer felt like a man left behind, defined only by scars and silence. He felt like a man who could be counted on, stand steady in the storm, and find his way forward. The evening deepened. Crickets began their chorus, and a dog barked somewhere across the fields. Jonah stayed on the rail, the air cooling against his skin, and the ache in his ankle reminded him of everything it had taken to reach this point. Valour lifted his head once, meeting Jonah's eyes across the pasture, then blew out a long, slow breath, the sound steady and sure. In that moment, Jonah understood that the ride was not an ending. It was a beginning.
A promise carried not in words, but in the quiet rhythm of hooves on dirt, the steady breath of a horse beside him, and the unspoken agreement between two beings who had chosen, again and again, to trust. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year, as if reluctant to let go of a land it had held too tightly. The snow melted in uneven patches, leaving dark earth exposed in some places and crusted ice clinging stubbornly in others. Jonah Hale sat on the porch steps, his coat collar turned up against the lingering chill, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. Out in the pasture, Valour grazed, his breath a steady fog in the crisp air, each exhale proof of a living rhythm that had once seemed impossible between them. The town had moved on, stories transforming into something softer with each retelling. In the cafes, Valour was called the gentle giant. At the feed store, ranchers who had once muttered warnings now asked Jonah for advice. Children told tales of the horse who had saved a man in the storm, their voices full of wonder. Jonah smiled when he heard these things, but rarely added to them. He knew the truth was quieter, made of repetition and patience, not miracles. Life settled into the ordinary that had always been rare for Jonah. Each morning, he rose before dawn, the rhythm of chores guiding his steps. He filled buckets, repaired fences, and brushed Valour's coat until it gleamed like polished obsidian. The stallion no longer struck rails or tested gates with fury. Instead, he met Jonah at the fence line, ears pricked forward, the calm acknowledgement of a companion who had chosen to stay. Wind teased the early buds on the cottonwoods. Maggie Torres arrived in her dusty pickup. She leaned against the fence, watching Valour move with a horse's long, powerful strides, finally at ease in his skin. "He looks different," she said, and Jonah glanced at her with a half-smile. "He is different," he answered. Maggie studied Jonah's face then, noting the same quiet shift she saw in the stallion. "You both are," she said, and left him with that truth. Workshops multiplied as spring deepened. Jonah and Valour traveled to nearby towns, showing what patience could create. He never gave speeches full of fancy words. Instead, he demonstrated. He let Valour drift close and step away, showing how not demanding was sometimes the most powerful demand. People cried, not because of tricks, but because they recognized the reflection of their own struggles in the horse's dark eyes. A nervous boy with a rescued colt watched Valour nuzzle Jonah's shoulder and whispered, "Maybe mine can too." Jonah bent low and told him, "Give it time." Schools invited them, and children gathered in circles, wide-eyed and eager. Jonah explained gently how horses measured honesty not by words, but by presence. He let Valour stand among them, steady and calm, while little hands reached to touch his muzzle. The children laughed, the sound bright against the quiet dignity of the stallion. Teachers later told Jonah that their students had written essays about trust and second chances, dogs rescued from shelters and friendships repaired after mistakes. Valour's shadow had stretched into lessons far beyond the pasture. Clint Rollins made another public declaration that summer at a community fundraiser. Hat in hand, voice gravelly but sure, he said, "I didn't believe in him when I sold him. I do now." Folks cheered, clapped Jonah's back, and toasted to the horse, who had become a symbol of hope. Jonah accepted it all with humility, but when the noise died down, he returned to the quiet of his ranch, to the steady breath of Valour grazing under the vast Wyoming sky. There were still hard days. Storms returned, though none as fierce as the one that had bound them together. Fences broke, ankles ached, and old scars sometimes reminded Jonah of battles far from home. But each time he felt the weight of weariness pressing down, Valour was there, steady and immense, a presence that asked nothing more than honesty. Together they weathered each moment, one hoofbeat, one step at a time. As summer waned, Jonah found himself reflecting more often. He thought of the first day at the auction yard, of the mutters and the fear, of the moment Valour had looked at him with both eyes, and something had shifted. He thought of the storm, the beam, the breath they had shared in the dark. He thought of the workshops, the children, the way strangers now waved instead of turning away. He thought of himself, no longer the broken veteran limping toward silence, but a man who had found reason again. The ride that changed everything was not planned. It was an evening washed in gold, the air sweet with cut hay, the sky soft as a bruise fading. Jonah saddled Valour with practiced hands, the stallion standing square as though offering himself to make the task easy. They rode out across the fields, not hurrying, not seeking any destination. The rhythm of hooves matched Jonah's breath, the sway of the saddle loosening the knots in his chest. At the crest of the rise, the land stretched wide before them, fences running like threads through the patchwork of fields. Jonah let the reins slacken, Valour choosing the pace, ears toggling between horizon and man. Jonah laid a hand on the strong neck, feeling the steady heat. He murmured that not everyone gets lucky enough to find a reason to go on. You and I were lucky. Valour flicked an ear back, shook his mane, and blew out a breath Jonah chose to hear as agreement. When they returned, and the world was hushed, as it was only before night settled, Jonah unsaddled slowly, his hand lingering on Valour's shoulder. The stallion lowered his head to graze, trusting the ground to hold. Jonah sat on the top rail, boots hooked beneath the slats, watching. There was no applause, no fanfare, only the quiet companionship of two beings who had stopped demanding proof from each other. In town, they called Valour a miracle. They spoke of redemption, destiny, and second chances written by fate. Jonah did not argue, but in his own heart, he filed the story under work, time, and luck that looked like grace. The horse had changed, yes, but more than that, Jonah had. He no longer carried the weight of being left behind. He felt whole, counted on, steady. That night, he left the window open, the cool air moving in and out like a tide. He woke once to the sound of a horse blowing softly in the dark and found himself smiling without knowing it. There would be more days, some easy, some not. Storms would come, fences would break, work would continue. But the cornerstone had been laid, solid and unshowy, bearing the weight so other things did not have to. Outside, Valour paused in mid-graze and lifted his head toward the porch, ears flicking, as though counting the rooms of the house and the man inside them. Then he lowered his head again to the grass, content in the uncomplicated business of being alive. In that simple act lay the whole of their legacy, a quiet truth that belonged not to the town, not to the stories, but to them. And in that quiet, Jonah finally understood that survival was not the end of the story. Belonging was.